Ever look at a map and think, hey, those two countries, they're practically holding hands. They must have a lot in common.
Yeah.
Well, get ready for a reality check because today's deep dive is all about two neighbors where that couldn't be further from the truth. Algeria and Morocco.
Oh, fascinating.
We asked you to dig into the history of their relationship, and let me tell you, it's a wild ride. You sent over some Wikipedia articles on it, plus some stuff on the Sand War of 1963.
Right.
Talk about enough material for like a whole season of intrigue.
What's so interesting about Algeria and Morocco is that their history is intertwined going way, way back, even before the French showed up.
Okay, so before colonialism.
Exactly. You had all these different tribes, dynasties, everyone vying for influence. But it was different then. The Sahara Desert, which you'd think would be a dividing line, was more like a crossroads back then.
So instead of a hard border, it's more like, here be dragons on those old maps.
Exactly. No one really knew or cared that much about drawing lines in the sand.
Until, of course, the French came along.
Right. Suddenly, everything needed precise borders, even if those borders made zero sense for the people actually living there.
Okay, hold on. So before the French, Algeria and Morocco were just kind of cool with each other.
Not cool, exactly. I mean, there were always rivalries, power struggles, the usual. But it wasn't about fixed borders so much. More about who controlled trade routes, who had access to the best oases, that kind of thing. Totally different context.
Gotcha. But then the French show up with their rulers and treaties, wanting to carve things up nice and neat.
Precisely. 1845, they come up with this thing called the Treaty of L'Allemagnia. Basically, they drew a line through the Sahara to define part of the border between French Algeria, because of course Algeria was under French rule, and Morocco. And get this, one of the arguments they used. A territory without water is uninhabitable, so why bother making it clear?
Seriously? They really said that?
Oh yeah, it's in the historical records. Almost like they were asking for trouble, right?
Talk about setting yourself up for a headache later on.
No kidding. Because fast forward to the 20th century, suddenly all that worthless desert is looking mighty fine. Oil, minerals, you name it. Now, those fuzzy borders matter, but they're still based on that old French logic that ignored the reality on the ground.
So we've got tension brewing already, then boom. 1962, Algeria finally wins its independence from France after a long, brutal fight.
You'd think that would be the end of it, right?
If only.
Oh boy, here we go.
Just 1 year later, 1963, the Sand War breaks out. Morocco sees a chance to grab some land in western Algeria, specifically the Tindouf and Béchar regions. They dust off those old pre-colonial claims, saying, see, this was always ours.
And I'm guessing Algeria was not about to give up any territory after all that.
Not a chance. They just kicked out the French. They weren't about to let Morocco waltz in. But here's where it gets even wilder. This is not just some small-time border dispute.
Oh, things escalated.
Big time. Those
Yeah.
Wikipedia entries you sent.
Yeah.
They do a good job of showing how this regional conflict became a proxy for the whole Cold War showdown that was happening globally.
Wait, seriously? Yeah, so you've got Egypt, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, a major power player in the Arab world, throwing their support behind Algeria.
And on the other side.
Well, the U.S. is watching all this, and they're getting anxious because the Soviet Union, their Cold War rival, starts supplying Morocco with weapons. And then, to make things even more interesting,
Don't tell me Fidel Castro gets involved.
bingo! Cuba sends troops to back up Algeria. I mean, Castro loved a good revolution.
Wow. So now we've got history, Cold War tensions, regional power struggles, all colliding in this one conflict.
And it's about to get even more complicated.
So we've got this powder keg, Egypt, Cuba, they're backing Algeria, the Soviets are on Team Morocco, and the U.S. is watching it all like, this could get out of hand really fast.
It was a tense situation, to say the least.
But the Wikipedia articles you sent said the Sand War ended pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, the fighting itself didn't last that long. Officially, it ended in 1964 with a peace treaty.
So everyone kissed and made up?
Not exactly.
Wow.
It wasn't a real resolution. More like they drew a ceasefire line and called it a day. They didn't actually agree on a permanent border.
So they just kind of kicked the can down the road.
Pretty much. And all that underlying tension, the mistrust, the fact that you had global powers meddling in the region, none of that went away.
Recipe for future conflict, right?
Exactly. And wouldn't you know it, a few years later, another conflict breaks out that drags Algeria and Morocco right back in, the Western Sahara conflict.
Okay, so remind me, what was going on in Western Sahara?
So Western Sahara was a Spanish colony, and as Spain started to pull out in the 1970s, Morocco saw an opportunity. They wanted to claim Western Sahara for themselves.
And I'm sensing this didn't sit well with Algeria.
You're catching on. Remember how Morocco had used those pre-colonial claims during the Sand War?
Right.
Well, Algeria had their own historical and cultural connections to the Sahrawi people, who are the indigenous population of Western Sahara. Plus, they knew firsthand how messy things could get if Morocco got too ambitious with expanding its territory.
So they weren't going to let Morocco just waltz in and take over.
Nope. Algeria threw their support behind the Polisario Front, which was the Sahrawi independence movement.
Oh, wow. So now it's even more complicated.
Right. It went from a border dispute to a fight for self-determination. And Algeria ended up taking in a huge number of Sahrawi refugees who fled the fighting. A lot of them are still living in camps in Algeria to this day.
This is all so heavy. Those Wikipedia articles, they give you the facts, but, it's easy to forget we're talking about real people here.
Exactly. Lines on a map, they represent real lives.
Families divided, traditional ways of life disrupted, all because of these geopolitical games.
It's tragic, and the human cost of these conflicts is immeasurable. And the thing is, it's not just history.
You mean even today?
Even today, travel and trade between Algeria and Morocco are super limited. You have these two countries right next door with so much potential for positive exchange, but that history of mistrust, it continues to cast a really long shadow.
That's heartbreaking in a way. Makes you think about that, saying geography might be destiny, but history sure loves to throw curveballs. And in the case of Algeria and Morocco, those curveballs just keep on coming. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I think it's important to remember those Wikipedia articles, they're a starting point, but we're just scratching the surface here. The relationship between Algeria and Morocco, it's way more complicated than any quick summary can capture.
Right, like we've been saying, you can't just glance at a map and assume, oh, they're neighbors, they must be buddies.
Exactly. There are centuries of history, cultural nuances, political strategies, not to mention the human impact of these conflicts that we've talked about, and they all shape how these two countries interact today.
It really highlights how ancient history isn't always that ancient. The effects, they ripple through time.
Absolutely, especially when you're dealing with things like borders, national identity, access to resources, those legacies, they can last for generations.
We've covered a lot of ground. From fuzzy pre-colonial borders to the Sand War, Cold War tensions, the Western Sahara conflict. Whew.
It's a lot to unpack.
And as always, we want to leave our listeners with something to chew on. So after this deep dive, what's a question you hope they're asking themselves?
Oh, that's a good one. How about this? What would a genuine resolution to these tensions even look like?
Ooh, interesting.
Well,
Because we focused a lot on the conflict, but what about the potential for cooperation?
right, because despite all the baggage, Algeria and Morocco, they share cultural links, economic possibilities, and they've both got a stake in a stable region.
So maybe instead of getting stuck in the past, it's worth considering what a future built on collaboration, not conflict, could look like for these two countries.
Exactly. What would it take to move beyond those lines in the sand? How can understanding the historical context help us imagine a more peaceful, collaborative future? Those are the questions worth grappling with.
Powerful stuff. Food for thought, and who knows, maybe even fuel for action.
I like that, fuel for action.
On that note, we'll leave you all to ponder these big questions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex and often tumultuous relationship between Algeria and Morocco.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep those brains engaged, and remember, there's always more.